Thank you. I now recognize myself for questioning. Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, I want to again thank you both for coming today and offering your scientific insights on the origins of COVID-19. We appreciate your professional training and your experience as you outlined in your testimonies. Your role and voice in the ongoing public discussion about COVID's origin is an important one. In your letter with your co-signers to Nature magazine, you highlight the notable features of SARS-CoV-2 genome that include, among other characteristics, its high affinity for human ACE2 and the presence of a polybasic furin cleavage site. Both characteristics enable the virus to infect humans effectively and contributes to SARS-CoV-2 ability to cause illness or pathogenicity. Your letter or opinion piece published in Nature magazine in April of 2020 also indicates that some pangolin coronaviruses exhibit strong similarity to SARS-CoV-2 in the receptor binding domain, including all 6 key RBD residues. Your letter also states that this feature is found in some Malayan pangolins imported to Guangdong province. You have stated that pangolins may have played some role in the recombination event that led to the COVID pandemic. Is that correct?
That is not correct. I don't think pangolins have played a role in the pandemic per se. The fact that we find similar viruses in pangolins and there is a recombinant history of the virus themselves, however, that recombinant history is very likely in bats.
Thank you, Dr. Gary.
In pangolins.
So I agree. I don't think there's a direct route from a pangolin to SARS-CoV-2.
That's interesting because there were comments that might make people believe otherwise that weren't necessarily in proximal origin, but were in the comments made amongst the researchers. Would you agree with that, sir?
I would agree with that, but there's been a lot of extra work since then.
Thank you. There has been. There has been a lot of extra work since 3 years ago. I would agree with that. And I think we should all be open-minded to that extra work. So is it correct to say that in order for a recombination of coronaviruses to occur, that the susceptible animals, such as a pangolin, and the reservoir or host for the virus have to be in close physical contact and that the recombination events happen within the same subgenus of virus?
That is incorrect. As I already stated, those recombination events likely happens in bats, not actually in pangolins.
Well, there's been discussion about it coming from a pangolin. And I'm curious how a pangolin coronavirus found in Guangdong province could swap genes with susceptible animals in Hubei province.
There's no reason to
I'm not asking you a question right now, Dr. Anderson. Let me just finish my statement, please. We cannot conduct this in this manner, but I will let you speak. Because I'm making a scientific point here based on some of the discussions that I saw take place between the members of the authorship, okay? And I'll give you your chance to rebut it because we want the truth and we want to know the scientific process and we want to have the scientific discussion, not talking over each other, but actually having a discussion. Is that fair?
That is fair.
Okay. So Guangdong province is approximately 603 miles away from Hubei. You note in your committee testimony that high-risk animals were discovered at the Yunnan market. You also note that genetic footprints of susceptible animals, specifically raccoon dogs, were found at the market. Were pangolins or bats sold in the Wuhan seafood market?
Not that we know of.
Not that I know of either. Has there been any genetic evidence for pangolin existence in the market?
Not that we know of, no.
Not that I know of either. Were any animal samples taken from the market positive for SARS-CoV-2 or from farms supplying the Wuhan animal markets?
There were no relevant animals that could have been positive for the virus sampled at the market because they had been removed prior to.
But or from the farms where they came from, none are reported. Were any environmental samples recovered from the market positive for SARS-CoV-2?
Yes.
Yes.
Several.
Now, Dr. George Gao, the former director of the Chinese Center for Disease Control, publicly stated that the Hunan seafood market was not likely the original source of the outbreak. Former CDC director in China, stating that the market could have served as an amplifier or a super spreading venue. Could you see the market being a super spreader venue?
The data is inconsistent with that scenario.
Inconsistent or consistent?
Inconsistent.
Really? People might argue that. The second genomic SARS-CoV-2 finding you mentioned in your written testimony cited the presence of a polybasic furin cleavage site, which contributes significantly. Dr. Anderson, is it plausible that such a furin cleavage site could be inserted by a scientist, such as in 2007 by US research from Montana State University? Is it plausible?
If you look at the furin cleavage site that we are specifically finding in SARS-CoV-2 has never been used in experiments prior to this. Further, the furin cleavage site itself is suboptimal and likely out of frame,
So I'm
suggesting
asking,
that this is a clear result of natural selection.
So I'm hearing what you say, doctor, and I appreciate that, but you said something there that stands out to me. And I think you're referring to nothing ever published. And that doesn't mean it's not plausible or possible. And that's where I stand different from you. And I know throughout a lot of the things that I'm reading, we've talked about nothing being published. A lot of things get published long after they're done, and some things never get published. And we'll get into that. Are you aware of the proposal that EcoHealth Alliance submitted in March 2018 to DARPA that outlined their intent to work with researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology to conduct genetic engineering that included inserting novel receptor binding domains found in SARS coronaviruses from the wild and human-adapted furin cleavage sites to assess the effect of their infectivity in humanized mice and, according to Dr. Zhengli Shi, possibly using palm civets? Are either of you aware of the proposal that EcoHealth Alliance submitted in March of 2018?
I assume you referred to the proposal diffuse. Yes, I'm aware of that.
Dr. Gary? Based on your professional experience and training, could deliberate recombinant research result in a virus with characteristics consistent with SARS-CoV-2?
I think it's important that we take a step back and focus on what's possible versus what is plausible or probable and what we actually have evidence for. Anything is possible. In our own proximal origin paper, for example, we say that we cannot disprove or prove any of the origin hypotheses. That was true at the time of writing that paper. That is true today as well. However, it's important that we focus on what do we actually have evidence for.
Exactly.
And what do we have evidence for is that if you look at the diffuse proposal, for example, is that, and I will admit it's a little messy written, so it's not clear exactly what they're proposing. But first of all, the work that's being proposed here is to be conducted in the United States, not in China. Specifically, they're talking about S2 proteolytic cleavage sites and glycosylation sites. That's not the specific site that is actually present in SARS-2. So if you look at the proposal of diffuse and ask the question, could that plausibly have led to the creation of SARS-CoV-2, is that in the world of possibilities, sure. However, is it plausible to think that that work would have led to this virus? My professional opinion on that is no.
You mentioned something, and I'm not saying this in some kind of an arrogant way, But you mentioned, I think there's times when we don't know what we don't know. And I think that needs to be considered. So when something is possible or plausible, we don't know one way or the other. And I sit on the Intelligence Committee. When COVID started, I was interested in what was happening as a physician. What is happening to people? How do we treat it? But we started finding other things. And it aroused our curiosity. So I will say that I think it's important that as more comes out, that you keep that in mind. I want to skip ahead to some of the things. There's more I would want to talk about. But I would say that there are so many revelations that have come about since the paper was written. I'm just curious if the Proximal Origins team would be willing to gather together and take another look at the lab theories with agnostic peer review. And can you do it without social media censoring or name calling? Or should we rely on the work of Dr. Jean-Paul Chertian and Dr. Greg Cutlip for their more comprehensive and detailed approach that we see from their scientific report produced in May of 2020? Would you be willing to regroup and maybe take a look at evidence that has come out? Or maybe evidence that hasn't even been revealed to the public yet?
As I stated in my opening statement, is there any new evidence that were to be unearthed suggesting that this could potentially have been associated with a lab? Of course we will consider that. However, it's important to understand too that the kinds of independent investigations that we have done as a scientific team are agnostic to the potential origin of the virus. We're simply looking at the virus itself, we're looking at early cases, we're looking at positivity of the samples, and those just happen to cluster around a particular market linked directly to the billion-dollar wildlife trade in China. That's an agnostic view of what does the evidence actually tell us.
Dr. Gary, in answer to my question. Your microphone.
Of course, we're willing to look at new evidence.
I appreciate that. I now recognize the ranking member.